Hello and welcome to the Intrusible Chamber. Today we'll be discussing the other God, so-called Manichean Christianity. I am very lucky to be joined by a first-time guest on this channel, David Binica. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I would like, if possible, for you to just give a brief introduction to the audience so we're familiar with what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as my wonderful host said, my name is David. I'm an independent scholar. Most of my interests and most of what I've written on, and I guess what my non-accredited expertise lie in comparative mythology, especially comparative Indo-European mythology and religion, and the intersection of those two. Recently, a lot of Italian Renaissance threads, but more specifically, and what I think led to this discussing this episode in the first place was the study of Mircea Eliade, the very famous Romanian historian of religions. Really, defined the entire school of the last century, and of course, Yuri Stoyanov's book that we'll be covering today grabs a lot from Eliade, lots of influence from Eliade, as well as a constellation of other comparative historians. But yeah, that's sort of my background, my interests. I've written a lot for Fiume. It's an Austrian-based magazine. I've written a lot for the UK-based Decadent Serpent on various themes like this, and I've appeared with the lovely Ruxandra, who I believe was also a guest on your show. On some of her podcasts, and we've written some things together as well.
Yes, for reference, Ruxandra was in an episode discussing Eliade, and she was also in an episode discussing a rather esoteric way of interpreting Alexander the Great, among other things. So wonderful to have you here. You've already alluded to the Yuri Stoyanov book, which indeed gives the title for this stream, which is focusing on a interesting syncretic and distinct tradition from a whole series of religions, but also an underlying tradition in Christianity. Indeed, when this book was first published in 1994, it was called not The Other God, but The Hidden Tradition. And very briefly, he begins the book by just defining Manichaeanism and its relationship to essentially the topic of this evening. Manichaeanism was, and is commonly invoked by its adversaries and explorers, as the classical doctrine of the two principles, and both within what is now recognized as religious dualist traditions, and in other religions, current dualism is often defined along similar lines. According to the celebrated Cathar tract, the book of the two principles, besides the good principle, as manifested in God and Jesus Christ, there is another principle, one of evil, who is mighty in iniquity, from whom the power of Satan and of the darkness and of other powers which are inimical to the true Lord God are exclusively and essentially derived. A lot of this conversation is going to revolve around the conflict between good and evil and the nature of the problem of evil. In terms of how really I was introduced to this topic, it was probably a completely different direction from how you approach this topic in terms of comparative mythology, which is often looking at things from the 18th and the 19th century and then working my way backwards. So in my experience of dualism, looking at this cosmic struggle between opposing forces, I, of course, am aware of it manifesting in Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, and, as alluded to, Manichaeanism. But I see it as a recurring element through all of European history, not just in terms of referring to Gnosticism being appropriate to Christianity. I see various analogies that could be drawn to Rosicrucianism, to Freemasonry, to the Perfectibilists in the 18th century, who are also known as the Illuminati, and the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment is really a pseudo-religious movement which was focused on gnosis, the light, versus obscurantism, which in Gnostic theology, there is the demiurge which obscures true reality. Gnosis, the light, is shone, and so obscurantism and superstition are destroyed alongside with it. Reason here is placed in complete contrast to Christian scripture. And really, to summarize where I'm coming from, I'm going to be reading a very short segment from Reinhart Koselleck in his sort of epistemology sort of shaping Critique and Crisis, the dualistic form of thinking, in terms of the history of religion and ancient heritage, through its inherently indirect and ultimately direct political criticism, became the expression and interpretation of an epochal development, that of an entire era, the emergence of the bourgeois world, part of, again, the emergence of what you can say dualism. You can also see it in terms of its displacement in Marxism and class conflict going forward. We're just seeing different modes of dualism which are being translated into other forms, whether it be economic warfare or whatever. The bourgeois stratum, growing in strength in social and economic life, and with a fresh worldview, saw itself increasingly as the potential holder of political power. It was dualistic thought which gave the new elite a sense of self and made it into what it was to become, a group of individuals who, as representatives and educators of a new society, took up their intellectual positions by negating what was then an absolutist state and a ruling church. Indeed, when we get to someone like Rousseau, Enlightenment society thought of the government as immoral, but of itself as just. Rousseau went one step further, not only in ruling that the state was immoral, but that it was also a compelled society. It compelled man to be immoral. The existing state corrupted man, and it was a situation for Luc Rousseau which left him no choice but to openly call for the overthrow of the state. Given what we're going to be discussing about the elements of dualism and seeing a series of contests between Satan and God, good and evil, are constant and they are reoccurring. Indeed, hopefully at one point I want to host a parallel conversation about a parallel conversation which is about the endurance of pagan ritualism. I don't mean in terms of humanism or anything like that. I mean real the existence of paganism, which will ultimately lead to the pagan revival that we see in the 19th century and the 20th century. So as far as I'm concerned, we are dealing with what Stoyanov refers to as a heretical thread running through the course of European civilization. And what I hope we do this evening is unpack it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
But just in terms of what I was referencing, in terms of the sort of intellectual tradition, which can be, again, we're going to start really with Zoroastrianism, but drawing it all the way to the 18th century and beyond, and seeing it almost as a force for modernity, that revolutions are inspired by the same impulse, again, to look at a direct antithesis. I mean, if you read Hegel and even understand dialectics and things like that, just the ideas of dualism are just constantly materializing in different forms with different contexts. And so this idea, again, we're going to be talking about obscure sort of Christian heretical movements in Bulgaria and the Languedoc. But all this is to emphasize that these things don't go away. In fact, they are an almost inseparable element of the history of Western civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, um, it's such a testament to exactly what you said, and it really is interesting that Stoyanov's earliest title for this book was the hidden tradition, or the hidden thread. This reference to this constant dualism that seems to be really baked into many facets of Western civilization, and that I think Stoyanov very convincingly shows as more or less starting in Zoroastrianism, in the Gathas and the Avestas. But what's really interesting is that looking at it from modern times backwards, and looking at the sort of pseudo pagan revivals of the 18th and 19th century, is that sure, on the ground, on a anthropological scale, you could say, oh well, this is made up and this is just something that they thought the pagans did, and here's a ritual that is reconstructed. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is that spiritually, that metaphysically, these ideas and the spirit has continued to manifest itself throughout the entirety of Western civilization, throughout our history. From the earliest monotheisms of the Iranian steppe nomads to the modern day, to even influencing some of the French mystical poetry and fiction, and Eliade that references even H.P. Lovecraft could possibly be the last inheritor of this sort of either hyper materialist or hyper immaterialist spiritual tradition. So I think that's a very interesting thread to pick up on.
And perhaps looking at a theological interpretation of H.P. Lovecraft could be a conversation, a very interesting conversation for another
Absolutely,
time.
absolutely.
So just to really reinforce everything we've been saying, returning to Stoyanov, he gives an overview of the crux of what we're going to be talking about. Paganism as a tradition, which is why it deserves its own dedicated stream, is far too diffuse to also lump into a conversation about the enduring elements of, say, Zoroastrianism, as we're going to see here. The core of religious dualism usually lies in a cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil, while expounding the course of the all-embracing collision between two principles. The different versions of religious dualism may furnish contrasting solutions to the principal theological riddles of divine reality, creation, and the origin of evil. Within the manifold tradition of religious dualism, Ugo Bianchi's terminology of dualism provides the most systematic treatment of the matter, defines three important lines of distinction. The first such line distinguishes radical or absolute dualism from a moderate or mitigated dualism. According to this absolute dualism, as developed, for example, by medieval Zoroastrianism and Manicheanism, good and evil, light and darkness, derive from two independent, co-eternal principles, irreducibly set up against each other from eternity. Immoderate or Manichean dualism, represented, for example, by some of the classical Gnostic systems, such as Valentinianism, one of the two principles is seen as a secondary agency stemming from the other principle, which is thus recognized as a sublime first cause. The second line of distinction concerns the temporary framework within which the two principles function in opposition to each other. In a dialectic dualism, they are seen as acting eternally in what is often perceived as a cyclical and repetitive process of time. And that specific aspect here has already been alluded to in terms of the long history of the thread. In eschatological dualism, that relating to the coming of some sort of divine moment of catharsis or the end of the physical world, with its focus on eschatological events and ultimate purification of the world at the end of historical time, the evil principle is destined to be vanquished in these last times, and thus is not recognized as an eternal agency. It must be destroyed. The third line of distinction is related to the attitude to the physical world and to matter. In this cosmic dualism, as exemplified by Zoroastrianism, the physical world is treated essentially as a beneficent creation of the good principle, hence as a good creation, although assaulted by evil, sin, and death. It is designed to bring about the ultimate destruction of all evil agency. Conversely, anti-cosmic dualism equates the physical world and matter with the principle of evil and darkness, which is seen as totally opposed to the spiritual world and light. Anti-cosmic dualism is usually strongly and anti-somatic, relegating the body to the evil world of matter and opposing it to the soul, the latter having its origin in the realm of light and spiritual good. Anti-cosmic dualism reached its most dramatic and evocative incarnation in the mythological systems of the Gnostic schools, where the rejection of a creator god, the demiurge, and his universe assumed extreme and occasionally drastic forms. And indeed, the explicit rejection of materialism is something I'm going to bring up towards the end when it comes to the Cathars. But I already alluded to at the beginning a Manichean tract, which was then subsumed into a Cathar tradition. I think many people are going to be waiting towards the end in terms of that conversation because it forms one of the great backdrops for European history, which is the Albigensian Crusades. But in terms of those three principles and those gradations and ways of trying to discern dualism in a historical and comparative religious context, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what strikes the reader who is already oriented towards understanding metaphysics as permeating ideology, whether or not, and you alluded this into the introduction, whether or not an ideology thinks of itself as metaphysical or not doesn't really matter. Take Marxism, for example. I think Marxism is very much in line with what Stoyanov calls the second line of distinction, especially when we talk about the need for the perpetual revolution that eventually swallows both oppressor and oppressed. And ultimately, the bourgeoisie or the capitalist or the oppressor class is removed as an eternal agency, but so is the lower class. So are the emancipated workers. So it's I mean, that sounds a lot like where Stoyanov writes on the end of page 4, in eschatological dualism, with its focus on the eschatological events and ultimate purification of the world at the end of historical time. And this also sounds a lot like Hegelianism, right? This sounds pretty similar to a lot of what is in Hegelian, I guess, eschatology, one might put it. And it really is this invasion of this is, forgive me for ever alluding to Eliade, but I really can't help it at this point. But Eliade really writes that Hebraic time, or the conception of time given by the Hebrews, is really one of the most startling and novel inventions in religious history. And its roots, its the vibrations emanating from that explosion really make themselves seen even in just discussing the structure of dualism across history, with temporal time, sacred time, profane time. Even secular ideologies have their linear sacraments. They have their time that is and is not profane. The perpetual revolution being that return to Eden, that going back to the golden age. And then obviously we get into the third distinction, the third line of distinction, we might get into some of the excesses of even Christian mysticism. And I know we'll talk about this later, where we get into some of the earliest convictions of the hesychasts, where some of the Byzantine authorities and even Italian authorities are really worried that some of this very monastic mysticism goes too far and actually encourages the Manicheans or the Bogomils.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful in terms of uniting those specific thoughts. As for referencing eschatology and Marxism, I mean, when I was talking about the sort of conceptual threads of the prophecy of Daniel, I mean, Marxism is literally just that, but through material gradations.
Correct.
What we're going to try and do now is find some sort of through line between many of the traditions that we brought up. Zoroastrian, of course, being the most significant starting point for all of this. Just to put it very, very simply, Zoroaster was a prophet in Iran. We're talking perhaps around 1500 BC, so around 3,500 years ago. And by the time that we have the Achaemenid Empire, the first great world Persian empire, Zoroastrianism had become the religion of the Persians. And it's not fair to say it was the state religion of the empire, because the satrapies had their own religious distinctions, especially if you go to somewhere like Babylon, which had a completely different cosmology compared to that of the Persians. But nevertheless, Zoroastrianism is one of you can almost say it is the first great identifiable dualistic world religion, and it spreads with the growth and the power and the prestige of the Persian Empire. Would you have anything to say on that?
Absolutely. Well, I think just to add to that is the fact that and you kind of alluded to this with Rosicrucianism, although I'm sure we'll get to some more nuance later. That all throughout the Renaissance, people like Ficino, like Giordano Bruno, they really go back through the Hermetic tradition, and they look at Zoroaster specifically, not necessarily all of Zoroastrianism, but Zoroaster principally as a prophet that could even be redeemed in Christian lore and Christian folklore. Um, and obviously Stoyanov alludes to this as well. But I think what's most striking to me about the connection, the through line for Zoroastrianism through Christianity, through even Judaism before before the birth of our Savior, is the apocalypticism that you see, and the dualism that becomes more extreme, as Zoroastrian reaches its zenith and then collapses in the Middle Ages, or the Zoroastrian Middle Ages, that is. There's some very, very interesting parallels between Christian end times and Zoroastrian end times and Jewish end times.
And another interesting specific element regarding Zoroastrianism is the existence, in addition to Aramazda, the beneficent god, are entities such as the Amashaspantas, the beneficent holy immortals.
Hmm.
Effectively, what we see is the precursors in terms of a comparative mythology between the angels. But we're talking also about a very sophisticated understanding of the conflict between good and evil, and all these elements are simply part of a greater whole. So I want to return to Stoyanov, as he very briefly tries to identify the crux of the cosmological struggle in Zoroastrianism. In the Zoroastrian system, to the perennial enigma of the origin of evil, Aramazda, as an absolutely good and just creator of the spiritual and material world, was stripped of all culpability for the presence of evil and the suffering in his creation. According to some, the modern Zoroastrians, the twin spirits emerged as the opposing but complementary forces of maintenance and destruction, the two poles of Ahura Mazda's power. But whether this view could be projected back onto early Zoroastrianism remains an open question. In traditional Zoroastrianism, evil seems to be revealed as stemming from the free choice of untruth by Angra Mainyu, later called Ahriman, who is, however, destined to be defeated and paralyzed by Ahura Mazda at the end of historical time. The Zoroastrian sacred history came to be divided into the three times: the first time of the original perfection of Ahura Mazda's good creation in its ideal and material side; the middle time, a time of mixture of good and evil caused by the incursion of the destructive spirit into the material universe; and finally, the eschatological time of separation of the two hostile spirits of good and evil, and the ultimate purification of the world. Again, I want to bring that up because you've also brought up Hebraic time. But if you look at, say, for example, the sort of historical sort of theology of Wacom Fiore, and this distinction between the three ages, which for someone like Fiore had to be distinguished in the way that the Trinity is distinguished into three segments, again, is repeated here in an early example of Zoroastrianism. In the first time, Ahura Mazda's creation exists in two states: spiritual or ideal, Menog, and the material Getig, while Angra Mainyu, Ahriman, is unable to corrupt its ideal side, being capable of transferring his own creations from the spiritual to the material state. The physical aspect of Ahura Mazda's creation is vulnerable to the encroachment of Ahriman, and following the formation of the material world, it is subject to the onslaught of a destructive spirit, which marks the beginning of the second time of mixture, the opposing principles of good and evil. Before I would really like to move on and talk about how this pertains to Christianity and Satanism. What would you have to say in terms of the specific conflict established in Zoroastrianism between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman?
Yeah, well, you did take the words right from my mouth when you referenced Joachim of Fiore. That was, it's one of the most startling parallels. But what I think is really interesting, comparing the earliest versions that we have, the very earliest unadulterated versions of the Gathas of Zoroastrian theology that we have, compared to the medieval theology that I referenced earlier, is the fact that you don't quite have um, a full causally evil principle just yet, because in the page before this, on 24, Stoyanov emphasizes the idea of free choice is fundamental to Zoroastrianism, and it seems more probable that the origin of evil lies not in the innate nature of Angra Mainyu, supposedly activated by choice, but in his selection of untruth and doing the worst things. And this starts to echo some of Sethian Gnosticism, some Messalianism tendencies, but it also kind of coalesces, and I'm sure we'll get to this, into almost a soft Trinitarianism, where you have the middle ground between the two opposing forces become personified, and that early tension is. I mean, it seems weirdly benevolent. It's almost as if the early Iranian magi sort of felt bad for Ohurmaz and Ahriman, that they had to make these decisions themselves, especially when they allude to the destructive spirit and the time of mixture. And as we go on, we've already said that it gets much more tense and much more volatile between the two uncaused causes. But that's really the only thoughts I had for now.
So I guess a question I would like to ask you is, where do you see the connection between Ahriman and arriving at a tradition where we have a established idea of Satan?
Yeah, well, I guess to just bring it into the modern era, I think this is more popular in evangelical Protestant forms of Christianity, but I think it's common to all Christians, all sort of the folk idea that we have in our head of Satan and of evil and of the devil is that Satan, right, the being a tippy top angel, as it were, to put it in in low church terms, made a conscious decision to choose evil. It was not forced; it was his choice. And obviously, in theology, there's a lot more. In canon, in dogma, there's a lot more nuance to that. There's a lot less certainty that there was some sort of free will exercise. But the idea that evil is free will is so potent, and infuses itself in Judaism and Christianity so potently, that I think there's this sort of, the Gnostic humanist really sees himself as that personification of the individual choosing something over the other, choosing asceticism over the excesses of bishops, choosing Ahriman over Ohurmaz. And later on things get topsy turvy, and the categories get very confused, as you know. But I think it's really interesting that you see the seeds of it almost too clearly in early Zoroastrianism, if I can go that far.
What would you mean essentially by too clearly?
I think the parallels are very easy to draw. Although obviously Stoyanov does an exemplary job of it, and maybe makes me think that it's easier than the job actually is. But just the idea that is coursing throughout these monotheisms and throughout the monotheistic tension with dualism, that ultimately evil is a choice and is not. It doesn't have to exist, or it doesn't have to be. And it was direct disobedience. It was the choice of the evil entity itself, whoever we're discussing. But obviously in medieval Zoroastrianism, or extremely um, uh, elaborated theological Zoroastrianism, Ahriman or Ohurmaz had to have chosen evil, and his other principle had to have chosen goodness from the very beginning.
I think just to round out in terms of these interesting conceptions, Stoyanov actually talks to the relevance between Zoroastrianism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And on page 62, he says regarding again the links between Zoroastrianism and Belial Satan, that the dualism between the Prince of Light and the Angel of Darkness remain dualism under one God, and it is God's inscrutable will that ordains a fixed era of Satan and Belial's dominion in the world. God created Satan Belial in the angel of hostility to corrupt, and with his dominions being a darkness, Belial's purpose was to bring about a wickedness and guilt, while the spirits associated with him were the angels of destruction, who follow only the laws of darkness. Conversely, the angel or the Prince of Light had under his dominion the spirits of truth, and was charged to help people who cast their lot in the portion of the light. And he also comes back to other traditions like Qumranism, but relating this to the early church fathers and Christianity later on. The early Christian notions of the devil, his rebellion, fall, his reign in this world, and final defeat were elaborated and conceptualized by the fathers of the church. The fall of Satan and the angels could be attributed to their pride or to the envy of men. The parable against the king of Babylon in Isaiah 14:12-15 was now firmly associated with the fall of Satan and linked also to Jesus' statement in Luke 10:18, I watched how Satan fell like lightning out of the sky. The king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28:12-19, originally all wise and blameless, but later obsessed by lawlessness and doomed to be hurled down from the mountain of God and devoured by the fire that Yahweh had kindled within him, also came to be recognized as Satan. Michael, however, was identified as being the archangel, however, was identified as the cherub who was placed at the gates of paradise to guard the way to the tree of life, Genesis 3:24, and as the angel who stood like Satan against Balaam, venerated against the early Christians, particularly in Phrygia, as a heavenly healer and redeemer. Michael emerged as the patron of the church and the medieval chivalric orders. Apart from leading the war against Satan in heaven, Saint Archangel Michael was seen as being entrusted with salvaging human souls from the power of the devil and conducting them to the place of judgment, while later Christian elaborations envisaged Satan as ruling and punishing the sinners in hell. In the early stages of building this Christian Satanology, where the devil was generally believed to have been created by God, but had fallen through his pride and envy and free will, the chronology and the outcome of his fall received various treatments. According to Origen, the famous early Christian historian who lived around the early 3rd century AD, the final defeat of Satan would lead to the destruction of his sinful and ungodly nature, while his original angelic essence would be resurrected and he would be saved to return ultimately to God. At the same time, the early church fathers had vigorously defended their orthodox tenets of evil as privation of good and goodness against a more radical dualist solution of the origins of evil, which were advanced in the Gnostic schools in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. In terms of, again, looking at this chronologically, when we talk about Zoroastrianism, we're talking about a tradition which predates Christianity by over 1,000 years and is, in terms of a sort of contemporaneous sort of historical movement, we're talking about the old dispensation. We're talking about Old Testament Judaism as being roughly contemporaneous with the ascendancy of Zoroastrianism in Iran. But in terms of, I guess, consolidating what Stoyanov basically referred to as a orthodox Satanology, do you think again that was in terms of arriving at that position to sort of arrive at a consensus? We have a tradition from which, again, all of the other sort of dualistic movements or the heresy arcs that we see in the quote unquote great thread can be effectively judged against.
In reference to the early Zoroastrian tradition, or in the more
In,
elaborated
t-
form?
in terms of this elaborated form of Satanology we have coming out of the early church fathers in the 3rd and the 4th centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, even a lot of the Byzantine inquisitions, which were, much less effective, or much less pursued, even one could say, than the Western Church pursued heresies, especially in regards to dogma. Origen is actually directly credited with some of the falsehoods, or these alternative demonologies that we come across in Catharism, in Bogomilism, in Paulicianism, where along with some extreme forms of Platonism, his works are being circulated in monasteries again. Mount Athos, as you've read, has actually, they've ended up convening a special council to throw out monastics who are, they deem, influenced too much by Origin into this demonology. So the language that's formulated by the church fathers, by Augustine, by the Eastern church fathers, is exactly the same language that's used by these just slightly later or even contemporaneous Gnostic and dualist heretics. So I don't think it's just a mistake of language necessarily, although again, we do have some garbling of categories and misattributed, the various codexes and the Liber Astros, and the various Bogomil texts become garbled and misattributed. But I do think that we're talking about the same things here. And you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran, and in these Qumran texts, you really have this direct, as Stoyanov says, this almost direct inheritance from the Zoroastrian tradition, where Michael and Satan Belial are in direct opposition to each other, like never before. Um, and then obviously the church fathers understand Saint Michael the archangel as being the captain of the armies of Israel, and now as we are Israel, as the church is Israel, that role is then expanded to the entirety of Christendom. Wherever two or more are gathered in his name, Saint Michael the archangel is there defending them, to paraphrase, right? So I think it's a very clear development. Yeah.
In terms of the other sort of enduring elements of Zoroastrianism in Christian law, Zoroaster emerges as this great sorcerer. He's referred to as the living star or the stream of the star. In some instances, he actually becomes a mystical sort of author of alchemy, works of alchemy. And it's perhaps again through this Renaissance tradition, late medieval tradition of Zoroaster, as one of these magi, one of these wise men, one of these great sorcerers, that we have, again, even coming to, I've mentioned the pagan revival, Nietzsche's using Zoroaster as his spokesperson at the end of the 19th century, which it's very interesting, again, to me at least, that of all the great prophets of antiquity in that tradition, I mean, we can look to other elements of Orientalism. I mean, Leibniz is sometimes credited with in sort of incentivizing Orientalism. Schopenhauer is another figure, but Nietzsche also. So unless you have anything really to say about, I guess, the continuing sort of hidden traditions of Zoroastrianism, there is another movement which is very interesting. A lot of people have no idea what this movement is, but it pertains to the region in Thrace. But do you have anything you would like to say on Zoroastrianism?
No, I would love to continue.
So this movement is called Orphism. And in terms of linking back to other episodes on this series, Intrusible Chamber, referencing Ruxandra's previous appearance when we were talking about Alexander the Great and trying to imagine a claim where he could be seen essentially as a Byzantine sort of anticipation. One of the elements was looking to the role of Dionysus, and Dionysus is harmonizing the East and Asia with the process of Hellenization. Another element which was referred to in that stream was Dionysus effectively acting as a superficial precursor to Christ in many ways. So first of all, sort of syncretizing and then displacing all of these traditions in a new form. But it's with Orphism, again, I reference Nietzsche intentionally because Nietzsche, one of his great dualistic concepts, again, for lack of a better word, focuses on the distinction between Apollonian and Dionysian modes of morality and thought. You can almost say simplify damn somewhat. But Orphism is one of these real traditions, not these philosophical reimaginings that we see in the 19th century, that actually deals with this contrast between the Apollonian traditions and the Dionysian traditions. For reference, Apollo is the Greek god of the sun, and almost it's an understatement to say he was iconic in terms of his usage and the image that people appropriated. I mean, I've just spent weeks talking about Louis XIV, so that example should be very obvious. But with Dionysus and his Roman equivalent of Bacchus, there is the allusion to grapes, revelry, and even debauchery. But Dionysus is in no way that simple as we'll get into. A distinct dualism between the soul and the body was to become the core of a religiosity in Orphism. And Orphism is relating to Orpheus, as in Orpheus and Eurydice in particular, an important trend in Greek mysteries, which seemed to have emerged in the 6th century and apart from the Balkans, came to exert an influence in Crete, Cyprus, and even in southern Italy. Traditionally described as a drop of alien blood in the veins of the Greeks, Orphism owed its name to a pre-Homeric fable, a Thracian poet and musician, Orpheus, to whom were ascribed many of the Orphic works. In Antiquity, the mythological genealogy of Orpheus varied and was depicted as a son of Apollo or to the Thracian king Oagres of a dynasty reputedly established by Dionysius Bacchus, when the god invaded Europe from Asia by the Hellespont and deposed the hostile Thracian king Lycurgus. The myths of Dionysus and Orpheus often allude to the interaction between the rival cults of Apollo, the god of order and the god of reason, and Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, a notorious dual deity who was believed to drive men to a frenzy, the divine madness, mania. Dionysus could be praised as a redeemer, as a healer, as a benefactor. He could appear as a lion or a leopard, but most famously in the form of a bull who could be revealed as the render of men and the one who delights in the sword of bloodshed. So if you look at him as the redeemer, the healer, and also as the god of wine, it should be obvious why there are many allusions drawn between Christ and Dionysus. In Orphism, Apollo and Dionysus appear reconciled, but a supposed link between Orpheus's reputed reforms of a Dionysian cult and various teachings remain controversial and bitterly debated, which should basically just be an asterisk put next to everything I think that's almost asserted in Stoyanov. I mean, I was reading around again for various articles in terms of sort of drawing a comparison here, and one of the prevailing themes of some of the further reading in particular, which I didn't end up referencing directly, was over the course of 30 years, I've come to basically disabuse myself of everything I previously asserted. So yes, it's very interesting in terms of intellectual about turns, but continuing on. Concern for the hereafter certainly was or came to be one of the prominent features of the Dionysian mysteries, which comprised ecstatic and orgiastic rites, including the omphagia, eating of raw flesh, so cannibalism, which were vividly realized in the Euripides masterpiece, the Bacchae. In the Bacchae, Dionysus comes from the Asia lands, from the mountains of Phrygia and Lydia to the broad highways of Hellas along with his Maenads to establish his cult on Greek soil, but it was suppressed by the king of Thebes, Pentheus, who is destined, however, to be torn asunder by the Maenads. Agave, his own mother, smitten by Dionysian madness, wrenches off and raises his head as prey, which she sees as a lion's head. The ecstatic Bacchic rites, Dionysian rites, could reach extreme forms as the Bacchanalia, which was eventually prescribed by the Roman Senate in 186 BC. In terms of this happy sort of strange coincidence between Roman censors and the banishment of certain cults, it's interesting how pagan Rome, even up until the time of Diocletian, will effectively do for Christianity some of the work in terms of suppressing these competing cults. But just again as an interesting sort of dualistic tradition, which is not born out of Zoroastrianism, but is actually born out of a semi-barbarous Hellenic tradition on the fringes of the Hellenic world in Thrace, which of course is modern-day Bulgaria with parts of Turkey and northern Greece. Again, it's in terms of looking at a geographical continuity and the significance of that region, it bears consideration. But all this is to say, from my perspective, that as we are drawing so many connections between dualism everywhere, Orphism is just one of these other elements of the threads of a picture of dualism that becomes part of this hidden tradition for European civilization and Christianity.
Absolutely, and I think actually that not Orphism isn't. I mean, it is absolutely like as you said, a thread in all of this. But I think I'm willing to put my foot out there and say that Orphism might actually be more potent in the immediate discussion of the formation of the Eutychites, of the Bogomils in Bulgaria, which is obviously ancient Thrace, or more or less congruent. I'm not going to try to start a modern day discussion over Balkan geography, but I think you know what I mean. It's very interesting that there are accounts from Byzantine polemicists, from apologists, directly accusing Bogomils and Eutychites, who obviously are more or less analogous with our discussion of Cathars, as having assimilated a lot of these Dionysian or even Orphic elements of the Greek mystery religions. And obviously, the Thracians and the ancient Dacians are also associated with Orphism. The cult of Zalmoxis, where Thracians and Dacians don't believe that this is their true life. They're willing to die, and they're so brave in battle because they believe that they're going to a next and better life. And the immortality of the soul seems to be this foreign seed, or, like as you referred to it, this drop of alien blood in Greek religion, albeit an extremely the Hellenes amplified and elaborate on it more than any Thracian context that we could possibly know of in the modern era. But Orphism continues to be such a big deal. The Orphic hymns, Orphic poems are such a big deal, even throughout the Renaissance, even to the modern day, I would argue, in occultic and esoteric circles. And I think the most open Christian interpretation of this is prefigurements of Christ, of sort of seeding the ground, of saying, hey, this is sort of more or less what Christ is fulfilling. You got the mysteries, but you didn't get the fulfillment of those mysteries. You're not quite there yet. And obviously the Bogomils take this up because there's plenty of insane things in the Bacchic Dionysian rites, and even in Orphic theology, to where the Bogomils say, "Hey, look, we are willing to mix this with our inherited dualist Gnostic threads." And in Eliade's book Shamanism, he actually contends that there's a possibility that Orpheus is not just Thracian in origin, but possibly part of this broader Eurasian, Indo-European tradition of shamanism that's been extrapolated into the Hellenic and Greek context. And then he goes on to say that this is also possibly influenced by Zoroastrianism or by some sort of dualist Buddhism. So it's very, very interesting where the threads line up, and how ecclesiastical and secular history line up.
And in terms of going to the modern era, when we have the Bacchagalia and when we have these eras of debauchery, the emphasis on eating flesh, many people attribute again this element of Catharism and Gnosticism and the rejection of the material world to even Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. And it's very fortuitous that you bring up the soul and the idea of the soul essentially as being a drop of foreign blood, because my next segment, which finally gives us a brief introduction to Gnosticism before we finally just touch Manicheanism. As with the Orphic religiosity, in Gnosticism, the soul was seen as a stranger and an exile in the body. The souls of men were precious pearls, divine sparks from the spiritual realm, and had descended into the wicked material world of the howling darkness to be imprisoned in material bodies that could only be released through redeeming meditation or gnosis, a revelatory knowledge of divine secrets. The divine substance was spread unevenly among men, and the Gnostic schools sometimes assumed a threefold division of mankind, in which the Enlightenment Gnostics themselves were the spiritual aristocracy, styled the pneumatics, the perfect or the chosen, who would be saved as they possessed the spirit, the pneuma, and that'll be relevant when we talk about the Cathars. The other class, the psychics, had soul, psyche, and were deficient of spirit, yet could gain some form of salvation, while the Hylics, with the earthly class, the enslaved, bound to remain entrapped in matter. These three grades of being in the universe were associated with three types of church: the angelic, the psychic, and the earthly. Again, emphasis on the idea that the interpretation with the physical body being associated with slavery. Of course, in terms of taking this through to a Christian reading of it, of course, the understanding is that the body is liable to be corrupted. It is liable effectively to incite the passions to be drawn to temptation, and thereby the body itself represents a form of slavery. This is simply taking it to a far more extreme level, where the physical body effectively needs to be completely annihilated in order to achieve the position of perfection, where one essentially is considered to be a free spirit. In Christian Gnosticism, Christ emerged as a heavenly spiritual redeemer, sent by the unknown supreme God to mediate this gnosis to men, or else only the pneumatics, and the demiurge vainly endeavored to thwart his mission. Hence, where there's an iteration essentially of Satan, which appears in all these different traditions. But before finally getting to a brief summary of Manicheanism, what would you have to say in terms of just that very sort of brief segment about Gnosticism?
Yeah, well, obviously, Gnosticism is as we both agreed upon when we introduced the episode, is very much alive. It's very much a sort of a living tradition, and maybe a constant symptom of being Western, and I think more than Western. I would argue, probably just a very basic condition of man that we have these dualist tensions. But in regards to hating the body and reviling the body, which is also, unfortunately appears in some of the writings of the desert fathers or the desert monastics that we see, some of those that take what Saint Anthony prescribes a little too extreme. It reminds one of a lot of modern transhumanism, or even of artificial intelligence and singularity, the uploading of consciousness, the abandonment of the body, the understanding that the body is never going to be a perfect vessel. Something that I think is, we've drawn some parallels between some of this dualism and the Renaissance, but I think is actually rejected in Renaissance humanism, but is accepted, as you said, in the theology of the Enlightenment, in the paratheology of the Enlightenment. And really fuels the Industrial Revolution and the age of technology, and is really being synthesized in artificial intelligence in the modern day. Now, obviously, that's a whole series of podcast episodes, but those are some of my immediate thoughts.
I was just actually going to ask you a question, whether you think there's almost like a Donatist link or a Donatist tendency in terms of the almost impossible standards that one would apply essentially to become part of an ecclesiastical office, whether that can also be directed towards essentially the inevitable corruption of the physical body, if that itself is to represent a spiritual office.
Yeah, I certainly think it's a tendency. The Donatists expected literal purity of belief, if I'm not, butchering my recollection of my catechesis classes too much. And I think I agree. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that statement. I think it's sort of the same impossible standard that somehow some party has, convinced themselves that they're able to get there, but no one is quite able to get there. And actually, the love of God does not forgive, past blame.
So all of these traditions have invoked some element of this cosmological dualism, but as the title of the stream attests, when we come to medieval thinkers and Renaissance thinkers even, Manichean Christianity or Manicheanism becomes the catch-all for all of these dualist tendencies. And essentially the question is, if Manicheanism is basically the great heresy, if we're again going to actually apply a dualistic conception of it, that Manicheanism effectively becomes the other, in this instance, the Ahriman. What is it? And where did it come from? And here I have a very short segment from François de Blois' argument on dualism in Iranian and Christian traditions. Manichaeanism was the most influential dualist religion after Zoroastrianism. Manas enjoyed the protection of Sasanian kings for about 30 years from 242 onwards, but then he fell from favor and died in prison, probably in 277. For reference, after the Achaemenids collapse, obviously Alexander the Great conquers the east. The Greeks rule there for a time, but in Iran they're taken over by an empire called the Parthians, who are eventually replaced by the Sasanians. The Sasanians are the last great pre-Islamic Iranian empire, and this is around the time not only of the formation of the Sasanian Empire, but it's around the time that they scored some fantastical victories against the Romans, such as the capture and defeat of the Emperor Valerian, if I'm not mistaken. The death of the prophet was followed by a severe persecution of the Manicheans in Sasanian territory, but the faith had already put down roots in the Roman Empire and in Central Asia, and it was there where it achieved its greatest success. Half a millennium later, in 762, Manichaeanism was adopted as a state religion in the Uyghur Empire, and about the same time it was accorded official tolerance in China, although it was prescribed again in the following century, and that's partly as a result of Tang dynasty tolerance rather than anything else. The gradual Islamization of Eastern Iranian and Turkic peoples put an end to the Manichaean presence in Central Asia as well. In the West, Manichaeanism receded quickly after the adoption of Catholic Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire. At the beginning of the 4th century, though isolated pockets survived, notably in Egypt, Saint Augustine of Hippo, before converting to Christianity in 386, was for many years an adherent of Manichaeanism, but by the 6th century, Manichaeism must have been virtually extinct in the Christian world, but its place was taken over in some instances by other dualist or semi-dualist religions or traditions, such as Paulicanism, Bogomilism, and Catharism. I also just want to emphasize that Manichaeanism is also simultaneously a dualist belief, but it's also a syncretist belief. It implies elements of Gnosticism, elements of Christianity, elements of Zoroastrianism, and indeed elements of Buddhism. So a lot of, again, speculation, as with the cult of Mithridatism, that it could have been one of these alternatives to Christianity in terms of sweeping over and imposing an iteration of a one world religion. Often Manichaeanism is held up as one such example, but just in terms of it itself representing such a syncretic hodgepodge of all of these different traditions, the fact that, again, it was post-Christian, it wasn't pre-Christian, and the fact that Augustine of Hippo, one of the greatest sort of doctors of the church who ever lived, was also a Manichaean, should inform the reasoning far behind that terminology and the enduring sort of relevance of the label, if not necessarily the exact sort of substance and application of the theology of Manichaeanism.
Yeah, absolutely. And continuing sort of that vein, it is really interesting that this becomes so potent in a post-Christian context, because we associate in our own modernist minds, hodgepodge and syncretism with, okay, well, that's a new age, and that person doesn't really believe too much, and okay, sure, you're a Wiccan, whatever that means, and yeah, you believe in rocks and crystals, etc. But this becomes one of the most influential, as we talked about, where we have synods of Manichaean bishops all the way in Tang Dynasty China. We possibly have Manichaeans in Italy at this point and all over North Africa, very, very widespread. And I think what it sort of boils down to, and what Stoyanov writes about on page 108, in Mani, again, the prophet of Zoroastrianism, in Mani's synthesis, the Gnostic anti-cosmic dualism of spirit and matter coalesces with the later Zoroastrian type of dualism of the two primordial, irreconcilable principles of good and evil, and the three times or epochs of the tripartite cosmic drama. In Mani's gnosis, the imprisonment and the suffering of the soul are caused by the fusion of two contrary principles of light and darkness, and the soul could be released from the great calamity of the prison body only through knowledge of their duality and the destinies of their struggle and final separation. So again, it's a very potent promise of salvation through esoteric knowledge, through gnosis. but combined with absolutes. It's not this sort of softer early Zoroastrianism where there might be some sort of middle ground that becomes personified, or where there's some sort of redemption in Christianity from dualism. It's a very strict and very, it becomes very interesting when we get into Manichean cosmology. Their understanding of the realm of darkness, their understanding of the realm of light, where we have very, very elaborated um, angelologies and demonologies and hierarchies of spirits and powers and principalities, that all end up being more or less assimilated into, and in various forms, obviously, into later Bogomilism and Catharism. Sort of continuing what you said earlier about the church pointing towards Manichaeism as sort of this, the father of all later evils.
On that note, it should be referenced that the article wasn't explicit enough in stating this, that the death of Mani in 277 again was a great moment of spiritual martyrdom and a redemptive act that essentially was positioned as a Manichaean equivalent of the death of Christ. But in terms of the great othering of Manichaeanism and how this was actually a pre-Christian process that began in the Roman Empire, in 302, Diocletian outlawed, and again, Diocletian, the Diocletianic persecutions, the creation of the Roman emperor as a literal god within the Roman constitution. Diocletian is the last hurrah in terms of a strict pagan continuity, but of course you also have to reference Julian within that tradition as well. In 302, Diocletian outlawed the followers of Manichaeanism in the Roman Empire with an edict that condemns the Manichaean sect as a subversive, malignant import from Rome's hereditary enemy, Persia, and links their abhorrent practice with the Maleficium. That Mani's association with Persia could provoke charges of proficiency in magic is also evidenced in the testimony of Ephianus, who asserts that Mani was well acquainted with the practices of the Magi, and his followers used astrology, amulets, phylacteries, and incantations. Some of these and similar accusations against the Manichaeans might have been partially provoked by Mani's reputation for magical healing and exorcism in Manichaean traditions, and by Manichaean anthropaic and exorcist practices. Legal and theological condemnations of Manichaeanism after the Christianization of the Roman Empire maintain resonances of Diocletian's sorcery accusations against the Manichaeans within the framework of a developing anti-heretical theological rhetoric and imperial and later Byzantine legislation. Consequently, Manichaean books and prayers could be denounced as replete with sorcery and as honoring the devil, while Mani himself could be represented as a successor to a lineage of infamous sorcerers. The association between sorcery, illicit practices, and Manichaeanism apparently persevered both on a popular and a learned level as the severe anti-Manichaean legislation of Emperor Anastasius and Justinian began to inflict on Manichaeans the death penalty. The legal and theological potential of combined accusations of Manichaeanism or sorcery was demonstrated by the charges raised in the 380s against Priscillian, Bishop of Avila, which introduced both and led to his execution in 386 after a trial at a secular council in Tyre. Avila, if I'm correct, is in Iberia.
I'm assuming so.
So just in terms of the proliferation of, again, perceived Manichaeanism, if nothing else, the harsh Justinian anti-Manichaean legislation was retained in later Byzantine law codes, and the term Manichaean continued to be employed as the equivalent of Dualists or heretical sectarians to condemn religious or political opponents. As with accusations of Manichaeanism, sorcery charges, particularly that of the Byzantine court, could also be used as political weapons. Such use of heresy and sorcery accusations makes a reconstruction of a history of heretical and sectarian movements readily recognized by the Church as Manichaean even more problematic. The association between magic and heresy, often resurfacing in these accusations, acquired, moreover, a lasting and menacing vitality of its own, capable of being resurrected with ease and targeted at a new sectarian or heretical groups, which began to proliferate shortly after the completion of the first Christian millennium, often seen as an anxious churchman, as a renaissance of Manicheanism, an ancient and dangerous revival of the Great Heresy. And the reason he references the Great Heresy is because he sees the Great Heresy as the thread of Paulicians, of Bogomilists, sorry, and Cathars. It's all part of this this Manichean tradition. But as we can see, in terms of the actual sort of substance of Manicheanism has, by the 5th century at least, been essentially confirmed by the Byzantine Church authorities and the empire, effectively as a catch-all.
Right, absolutely. And it is interesting how, Stoyanov kind of relates how difficult it becomes sometimes to separate out the different accounts of of which specific heresies and which Gnostic orders or which groups we're dealing with. And then in our modern ears, it's a little different. When we hear, heresy and magic, we almost hear the same thing, or we assume the same thing. But a lot of Byzantine, especially Byzantine theologians, demarcate the two. And I believe it's actually Hugh of St. Victor in this era, and I say this era, I mean the Cathar era, in the time period of the Albigensian Crusades, that specifically revives those charges. And I believe Augustine is maybe the first church father that directly accuses, his former Manichean heresy of also practicing witchcraft, but of all heresies, all anti-Catholic Orthodox heresies, of partaking in witchcraft, and even in not differentiating between categories like low, high, middle, left hand, right hand witchcraft, which were more or less practiced by farmers who are nominally Christian might have practiced low magic, and then all of a sudden, in canon law, they're subject to the same treatment and same othering as somebody who was guilty of capital punishment. And this becomes true later, also in the Byzantine sphere of influence. And what's, I think, the most interesting thing about a lot of this is how the contemporaneous Waldensians, who I think, looking with, hindsight view, would probably not be conflated with actual Manichaeans, who are more likely part of that evangelical and even Medicant order, underlying spirituality in Western Catholicism, in Western Christianity. Even they're conflated with this resurgence of Manichaeism, even though some former Waldensians actually go on to persecute Cathars that are contemporaneous with them. These are charges leveled at Lollards. I believe the Hussites as well, and certainly in the extremely polemical era of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, you still have this idea of the Manichaeans or the Manicheans surfacing and resurfacing. It is interesting, however, getting into the Balkan area, getting into the diffusion of dualism into the West, how they start to self-identify from their own bishoprics and their own dioceses, and how they don't seem to like to associate themselves with Manichaeism at all, but refer to themselves more as Bulgars or Bogomils, lovers of God, which might also stem from an interesting Greek tradition, where again we find ourselves in this this traditionally Orphic region, this traditional area of mystery cults in what is now the Balkans and Eastern Europe.
And in terms of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, this is a good time to finally arrive at the Paulicians, or the Paulicians. The Paulicians emerged in the complicated religious world of the 6th century Armenia, which in 389 had been partitioned between Byzantium and Sassanid Persia. Later Byzantine polemical works consistently described the Paulicians as outright Manichaeans, and attributed to them the radical dualist doctrine of the two gods or principles, the evil creator of the present material world and the good god of the future world. The Paulicians are also described as professing docetic Christology. Christ's incarnation was proclaimed illusory, and the Virgin Mary was praised not as the mother of Christ, but of a heavenly Jerusalem. However, the differing readings of the references to the Paulicians in the Armenian and Byzantine sources have led to conflicting conclusions as to whether they were originally dualist or embraced dualism later in their history. The influential view that Paulicianism originated as a dualist heresy has been strongly challenged by a recent wide-ranging assessment of the Paulician heresy and teachings which argued that both the dualist and docetic doctrines represent later traditions in the Paulician movement. I just want in terms of recent scholarship, this book came out 25 years ago. And I also want to make it clear, if it wasn't obvious already, David, if you want to interrupt me at any point or to sort of interject, then please do so.
Yeah, absolutely.
According to this reassessment, original Paulicianism adhered to the adoptionist teachings current in the early Armenian Christianity, which held that Christ had been adopted as the Son of God during his baptism. However, this reconstruction of Paulician religious evolution has not succeeded in explaining convincingly the timing and cause of the later Paulician doctrinal reorientation. It's hypothesized scenario that this dualistic reformulation was carried through the Paulician heresiarch Sergius in 19th century Byzantium, as well as the suggested bridging of the sources for the heresy that have met strong criticism. The Byzantine reports of Paulician teachings reiterate their dualism between the recognized creator god and ruler of the world and the concealed god of the world to come, who could be seen as the Lord of the heavens. In other words, this would actually conform with a rather demiurgical conception of God. But its origins have been variously traced to Manicheanism, Gnostic, or Marcionite influences. Just for the sake of the audience and in terms of our sanity, in terms of being able to hold on to all of these labels, would you be able to give any sort of definition or explanation for the users on Marcionism?
I'm actually a little less familiar with definitions surrounding Marcionism specifically. I know that, I mean, okay, obviously we're discussing dualism. It's extremely dualistic. Um, I believe one of the Marcion's biggest points of contention was that there is a supreme God of the Gospels of the New Testament, and that this is not Christ. And I believe it also is like a garbled form of Docetism. If I'm if I'm not mixing up all my very similar, apostolic heresies. And I believe one of the largest contentions also surrounding their versions of the Gospels is that they have a shortened and allegorical reading of the Gospel of Luke, and this is actually very common with all Gnostics, is that they take the Gospels to be extremely allegorical. And there's something you mentioned before where we're discussing the reception of Paulicianism, of Marcionism, and there's these debates in scholarship, surrounding did these start out as dualist heresies, or were there some sort of previous spiritual impulse that was then subsumed under the dualist label? And what's interesting is that you see this in discussions of the Bosnian church, of this, this highly isolated, almost hill church that is more or less Catholic, more or less Orthodox. But then you see in the late medieval period, some of their liturgies are one for one copies of dualist liturgies, of dualist rituals, even. So there's actually historical precedent for this sort of subsuming of perhaps the Paulicians weren't actually dualist at the beginning and represented a different holdover or a different influence. But I think there's something we haven't mentioned yet, the possibility that some of these dualist heresies are completely novel and are completely creations of themselves, which is almost impossible. But we see a lot of innovations in Bogomilism. In obviously the most innovative heresies, would be the early ones, like Marcion. Um, and then I believe also, one of these through strands with Marcionism that we should emphasize this throughout our conversation, throughout this live stream, is the extreme asceticism of the Paulicians, of the Marcionites, of their inheritors, the Bogomils and the Cathars. So for Marcionism itself, you got the wrong guy for a full definition. but just trying to relate it to some of what we've been talking about is probably the best I can do for you.
Well, no, but thank you regardless. And in terms of creating a wholly sort of novel situation, just geographically, we're talking about an area in eastern Anatolia that straddles Armenia and the Roman Empire. And of course, this was an area that had been under a profound Sasanian influence. In terms of Armenia itself, we're talking about a different Christian tradition. We're talking about a church which actually predates that of the Roman Church under Nicene Christianity and Constantine. We're also talking about a church that later adopt Miaphysitism as opposed
Yep.
to Diaphysitism. So there are, and that itself is its own sort of dualistic rabbit hole, which we don't have time to
Exactly.
go down this conversation. So, needless to say, is that in this particular region, all of these ideas are abounding at the same time. The
Yeah,
Byzantine
and
yeah,
sorry, go for it.
no, by all
I was
means.
also going to say you also have traditions that associate Armenian Polytheism um, with backwater agrarian movements, as it were. A lot of almost, Marxist, and in Marxist historiography, proto-Marxist peasant revolutions, and obviously this is a big point of contention in Catharism, where it's almost a bottom-up movement, obviously financed by a certain class of nobility that has a bone to pick with the church. But in Armenia, you see almost the same thing, where you have the Armenian Christian monastics, in whatever form we want to define them as, teaming up with more or less popular uh, evangelistic leaders in depriving nobles of their land, and then also coming up with an almost dualist gospel that Polytheism shares its roots with. So it's interesting that no matter where we are, and again, Armenian religion at this time is still very, very much not a purely Christian landscape. We're still dealing with remnants of Iranian Zoroastrianism. We're still dealing with remnants of even, native Caucasian cults and faiths, whatever those might be, and we're still
And to
dealing
make it
with.
even more complicated, by the end of the 7th century, Armenia is turned into a Arab emirate.
Exactly, exactly. So we're having all of these different melting pots meeting in the same area, and expecting expecting neat definitions and categories to come out of it. But I think it's interesting. I suppose my point is, I think it's very interesting that sort of the same social movements are associated with these dualist cults, no matter where they are. Now, obviously, again, in Toulouse, in the Languedoc, in the Midi area of France, the situation is a little different, but not so in northern Italy, not so in the Balkans. And then another big thread of this is the fact that the Byzantines moved a lot of these Paulician heretics into their own hinterland. A lot of these Armenians were used to garrison border fortresses in Bulgaria, in Thrace, in Macedon, and far from becoming Orthodox, like I think the Komnenos dynasty wanted them to be, or as is written in the Alexiad, they actually were able to propagate their heresies even more, and they became even bigger heretics and were even less willing to renounce their heresy. The Armenian connection is also extremely fascinating.
In terms of the population transfers, you just took the words out of my mouth, so thank you for that contribution. The
Yeah.
Byzantine chronicler of Paulicianism, Peter of Sicily, traces the beginnings of the original Manichean Paulicianism to the missionary activities of a Manichean woman called Kalinice, who taught the heresy to her own sons as a viper mother reading two snakes, and preached it around Samosata in eastern Anatolia. While this report about the female Manichaean heresiarch seems largely fictitious, the tradition that the formation of actual Paulicianism as a Christian dualism should be ascribed to Constantine of Manalis, active in the region during the era of Constans II. So this is just after Heraclius in the 640s. It is almost certain that Paulicianism owed to Constantine its specific Christian dualism and Doceticism, the first version of its canon comparing the four Gospels and the epistles of Paul, the enduring veneration of Paul, and the foundation of its first church in Chibossa. Constantine was eventually accused of Manichaeanism and executed. He was the first of the Paulician religious teachers and leaders, the so-called didaskaloi, who continued the Paulician missionary work and sometimes came to share in the fate of the other didaskalos. Since the beginning of its diffusion in Byzantium around the mid-7th century, and for more than 3 centuries thereafter, Paulicianism posed a series of serious problems for the Byzantine authorities. At the height of their influence, the Paulicians established 7 churches in Armenia, Asia Minor, among the Church of Corinth, reputedly founded by St. Paul, which was regarded as the mother church of Paulicianism. From the 8th century onwards, the Paulicians also emerged as a factor in the Byzantine-Arab confrontation in eastern Anatolia in 759. Paulician colonists entered the Balkans for the first time, having been resettled by the Emperor Constantine V, along with other eastern heretics in the plague-stricken Thrace. So just before, I really just want to give a brief summary of the history of Roman Thrace and Slavic Thrace and Bulgaria, because it's, again, a major part of Stoyanov's contention. On the name Paulician and the emphasis again of venerating the legacy of St. Paul, to what extent again can you say that Paulicians were in any way sort of beholden to an authentic Pauline Christianity?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because, of course, you know, laying all my cards on the table, I consider myself a fairly Orthodox and Catholic Western Christian, and I'd rather not think that anyone would create a heresy out of St. Paul's teaching, his teachings. But there's obviously, you know, throughout Christian heresies, throughout Christian influence or Christian colored dualism, there is a tension between the teachings that are associated with St. John the Baptist and with St. Paul the Apostle. And obviously, I think, you know, one of the most enduring relics of this, artifacts of this, is the modern day Mandaeans. You know, those who essentially view Christ as Antichrist and view St. John the Baptist as a messianic figure. To the extent that they are actually taking Paul seriously, they seem to be extreme, either anti-Judaizers or Judaizers. And again, this is the confusing thing with a lot of polemical and apologetic accounts of these heresies, is that they tend to be convicted with complete opposites. They're either extreme Judaizers and then they have orgies, or they're extremely ascetic and have orgies, or vice versa, or they're very Jewish, or they're so extremely incredibly barbaric. So as to the extent of actual Pauline Christianity being a vein in Paulicianism, I'm pressing the big red no button, because I think they're associating themselves more semantically, more with the gravitas of a sort of Pauline Christianity, rather than actual theology. Although, you know, it can't be discounted. I don't think I'm necessarily qualified to speak to that. I mean, I'm not an expert in specifically Pauline theology, but just being a, you know, relatively well-read Christian, not to toot my own horn, I really truly do think that because I have discussed this with other people, and I've thought about this pretty deeply. Why so many dualists and so many of these, you know, contemporaneous Christian heresies take these stances? There's something there. There's clearly a tendency to reject the Old Testament, to go with the New Testament, not just with the New Testament, but almost specifically and only with, you know, the writings of St. Paul or the teachings of St. Paul. I don't know quite what to make of it, but I know it's there. So that's, you know, a long way of saying I'm not sure. Here's what I know.
Well, just to add to your frustration and confusion, then, um, you've again emphasized the role of the Judaizers, and, you know, in terms of my own reading of Russian history in particular, again, that's a subject that's not going to be satisfied in one way or another. But you've now referenced again a excessive sort of iteration of emphasis on Pauline teachings that gets rid of the Old Testament. Do you think, again, there's any correlation between dualism and wanting to de-emphasize the Hebraic elements of Christianity?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, no. I think that's one of the most glaring features of heretical Christian dualism. Is almost a physical revulsion to the Old Testament and to quote unquote, and God forgive me for blaspheming, but calling God in the Old Testament a completely separate God, a malevolent, evil God. And that's, obviously in our own day and age, that's a pretty common pedestrian, popular accusation leveled at Christianity. Not just by atheists, but just by, other um, religions in the sort of Abrahamic monotheistic tradition, as far as we want to stretch that term and those definitions, that somehow the Old and New Testament are diametrically opposed to each other, or even in the New Testament that the teachings of Christ and Paul are diametrically opposed to each other, and obviously the unveiling of the Holy Spirit of both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the crowning achievements and the fulfillment of the Old Testament in the New. These are dense theological matters, but they're also of immediate and practical um, importance to Christians, because this is the very basic bare bones of what we believe. We're not supposed to reject the Old Testament. We're supposed to view the New as its fulfillment. And the new doesn't make sense without the old, and that's why we're able to come up with a million different heresies of Yaldabaoth. But again, um, this is part of the tension in our faith, and it needs to be contended with. And obviously, we don't necessarily have the heresies of Polytheism in the modern day. There's no one going around calling themselves that, unless there's some sort of, Richard Dawkins level of Reddit user. But it's important to know about. It's important to discuss, and there certainly is something there with this rejection of the Old Testament.
I mean, just if you think it's only the Paulicians who are going to be accused of being sort of Reddit tier LARPers, I think we've all been tarred with that brush at one point or another for just
Yes.
expressing completely mundane views. But anyway, um, regarding Stoyanov's views on the Great Thread, he emphasizes so much about Thrace, now Bulgaria. Now we've finally reached the Paulicians' odyssey in terms of arriving there. As you may remember, we talked about the Orphic traditions, we talked about the cult of Apollo, but in particular Dionysius, Bacchus, and how this was, again, a reinforcement of Hellenic traditions and local Thracian traditions. But Stoyanov advocates for a position which I've only ever really seen in another historian of a comparative historian of civilizations, Arnold Toynbee, which was about the, for lack of a better word, the melting pot that was the region around modern day Bulgaria between the 9th and the 12th centuries. To really reference what happens in this region, of course, it is already a zone of sort of contention between Hellenized civilization in the south and more Latinized civilization in the north towards the River Danube. But in the 6th century, with the elimination of the Lemurs under Justinian, the Slavs begin migrating into that region, and Bulgaria becomes to a large extent Slavicized. Then you have the arrival of the Bulgarians. The Bulgarians represent many sort of disparate traditions. Their Heimat, the original homeland, is situated in the northern Volga region around the city of Kazan in Russia. And as far as Stoyanov is concerned, again, it's the amalgamation of Turkic traditions, sort of even older sort of Indo-European traditions, Siberian traditions. All of these elements are carried with the Bulgarians, the Bulgars, as they arrive in the region that we now know as Bulgaria, and they become established, kind of like I would say the Normans in England, as a Turkic hierarchical strata over the Slavs, but eventually they become assimilated into Slavic culture in the region. And through a process that we see, the creation of the Glagolitic alphabet, which sees the Christianization, mainly to Orthodoxy, of the Slav groups around Byzantium and the Black Sea. And then we see the creation of the Cyrillic alphabet, one of the great, again, victories, cultural victories and religious victories for Orthodoxy vis-a-vis Catholicism in the West was in bringing this new Bulgarian fusionist state to align with Constantinople. But that is again to say the fact that Bulgaria and Byzantium were constantly engaged in a struggle with one another. The reason I'm bringing all this up, this fascinating history when it comes to medieval Bulgaria, is there seems to be a great amount of intellectual attachment, I would even say fetishism, around this particular period. It's often reviewed as the great what if in the civilization of that region, especially as far as people like Toynbee are concerned, that there was a creative vitality and a dynamism in Bulgaria that should have induced Byzantium to form a cultural alliance with what was then the greatest other Orthodox power, because Russia at this time wasn't even effectively Orthodox. But instead, under the Bulgar slayer, Basil II, in the beginning of the 11th century, we see a systematic conquest of the Bulgarians and a subjugation that lasts until the Asen Empire in the end of the 12th century. And of course, this all comes to all of the various religious cults that we see in terms of looking at these dualistic traditions. What Stoyanov tries to present is that other than the Paulicians, and as we're going to see with the Bogomils, all of these Asiatic, you can almost say Turanian traditions are being brought in through Central Asia and arriving in the Danubian basin. So that is my very sort of short history of why this region is significant to many scholars, especially looking at it vis-a-vis Constantinople. My last comment on this will be that I think this actually follows in a similar thread that we see with the Languedoc, which is many contemporary historians try to associate what happened to the Cathars in the Albigensian Crusade as a form of not just a religious persecution, but a form of cultural genocide. I guess, again, if you're going to apply that sort of logic, then the Bulgarian situation would be the equivalent of the Albigensian Crusade perpetrated by the Crown of France, except instead of the Louis VIII in the 1220s, it will be Basil II in the 1010s. So I'd like to have your opinions on really any of these points or all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So great history. You encapsulated it very well. I definitely like that's it's a stretch for me to compare the two. I think you have it's very different from being a more or less petty landholder slash coming from a ducal line in southern France to a literal steppe warrior class forming what they wanted to be a third Rome. I mean, in Tsargrad in Bulgaria, literally city of Caesar. I mean, they weren't, you know, under the period of Simeon, who is converted to Orthodox Christianity and who really wants to bring Bulgaria into this inheritance. He's not just bringing Bulgaria into this inheritance as a lesser member, or in the past where the Byzantines only elevated. What we understand as the Bulgarian emperor up to the rank of Caesar. So, which is still a huge event for the Byzantines, but was just short of the mark for the Bulgarians. And eventually, I think had history played out differently, and this is one of those big Toynbee esque theories, is that eventually I do believe the Bulgarian Empire wanted, or the Bulgarian royal line wanted to take over Constantinople because they understood that Constantinople could not be replaced even by a sort of Bulgarian attempt at an equivalent in Tsargrad. The spiritual legacy of Constantinople had to be centered around Byzantium, had to be centered around the vestiges of the Eastern Roman Empire, and that manifests itself in Constantinople, and even to some extent to this day. We see the enduring allure of Constantinople and of a Byzantine legacy. And I think what's also very different about the Bulgarian scenario is that you still have, Bulgarian royal houses who are very, and again, I'm speaking when I say Bulgarian in this instance, I mean the essentially Turkish slash Uralic nobility, they essentially still understand themselves as pagans, as Tengryists, as what have you. Now, obviously, the situation, the religious situation in Bulgaria is much more diverse for a few reasons. One, being steppe nomads originally, they still have this like general understanding of religions as well. As long as you are able to pay your taxes and fight an army, I don't really care. And then two, they're very, very accommodating to heresiarchs and heretics that are thrown out of the Byzantine Empire, because these are very learned men. This isn't anymore just a heresy of the lower classes. You have very learned monastics, bishops, even patriarchs that are accused of being Patarines or Cathars or Bogomils. The Bogomils, infamously associate themselves with some of the wearers of the purple of the interior noble houses of Byzantium. So it's not just that we're trying to parade around as Byzantium, or we're trying to just inherit the Byzantine legacy. We're trying to live it, and we'll do that in any means possible. So I think, just speaking broadly to Eastern European, Bulgarian, Byzantine history, that's a major difference. And then I do understand the line of cultural genocide in the south of France. I think it's very nuanced. I think it's much more nuanced than just that.
Oh,
Obviously,
by the way, just to emphasize, I don't agree with that contention, but that
oh
is
yeah,
basically
absolutely.
become academically rote.
Correct. Yeah, no. I didn't think you were arguing for it. I know exactly what you're mentioning. It's interesting to me that you have Cathars and Patarines not in the Languedoc, not in the Midi, not in the south of France first, but you have them in Strasbourg. You have them in Paris first. You have them even in the German lands, via merchants, and in northern Italy before you have them in that area of France. So obviously, with any sort of conquest and with any debate today, we're going to have inane discussions of colonialism and post-colonialism and cultural ethnic genocide, whatever we want to say. But this was a religiously driven crusade, and you even have instances where the King of France has no interest in pursuing this, and it's literally pursued by inquisitors, by unordained inquisitors, by bishops riding on horseback into the south of France. And you even have instances of local Catholics in the south of France aiding and abetting um, these various heretics, the Cathars. And I think when we're approaching comparative analyses of the Cathars and the Bogomils, because obviously the Cathars appeal to the Church of Bosnia, they appear to Bogomils as sort of their ancient heretical pedigree. I think it's very important to carefully balance out accounts of these heresies by contemporaneous Orthodox Christians. And when I say that as a very self-conscious Western Christian. I think a lot of the accounts of Cathars are probably more reductionistic than a historian or someone who is well acquainted with primary primary sources would like. And I think it's very well balanced out, or very nicely balanced out by Byzantine writers who are a little less harsh, which for good or for evil, but they do bring into account more of the on the ground facts. And I think I actually wrote an essay a few years ago on a Byzantine apologist and Platonist that Stoyanov mentions, Michael Sellos. He mentions the Eutychites or the Thracians or the Bulgarians. Again, these are all the same, essentially the same group that we're talking about, in this sort of Socratic dialogue on the operation of demons, which is available, I believe, from Golden Horde publishers. If anyone in your audience wants to look at it, but it's also he actually wants to elaborate their beliefs so that we have a more constructive apologetic against them. And this is where we find out that there's actually fundamental theological differences even in the seemingly united heretical front, where again you have these going back to the very beginning of the live stream, you have these three distinctive forms, moderate, dualism, absolute dualism, monarchical dualism. You actually have all of these playing out in what was the modern day back then, in Michael Sellis's own day, which is also incredibly interesting. So it seems that with all of the diversity that having pagan Bulgarian overlords creates, you have such an interesting situation in Bulgaria, in the Balkans. And, even in the 13th century, we're leading. The Byzantines are leading crusades against the pagans on the the peninsula of Mani in Greece that are still worshiping more or less the ancient gods of Greece. Obviously, again, in a highly garbled, almost Julian the Apostate version of paganism. So it's fascinating, and I love Toynbee because he has these amazing, sometimes harebrained what ifs of history. But if we're gonna talk about historical controversies and historical episodes, um, I think Dmitry Obolensky lays this out really really well in his book, The Byzantine Commonwealth. I think there truly was a way to have maybe this Eastern European Balkan Orthodox bloc, and I do think it was missed. But I don't think that same situation was mirrored in the south of France. I think in the south of France, you just have diametrically opposed heresies, whereas in Bulgaria, you have this soft dualism that is, we might be okay with hesychasm, we might be okay with more orthodox mysticism. So, anyways, that was like a full 10 minutes of ranting and rambling, but I wanted to make sure I brought both threads of what we discussed together.
And just again for reference, in terms of my knowledge, hesychasm is a form of sort of Orthodox mysticism.
That's correct. Yeah.
As for again, just sort of continuing and try to keep this as concise as possible in terms of the traditions of Paulicianism. They gravitate around a city called Philippopolis, but the Byzantine chronicler Eutemius had a very sort of interesting contrast in terms of now migrating this conversation from the Paulicians to the Bogomils, which was that he was encountering heresies in the sort of newly acquired lands of the Byzantine Empire and what was then the Bulgarian Empire at the end of the 10th century, and he said that unlike the Paulicians, whose heresy was overt and less dangerous, the Bogomils were prepared to feign orthodoxy, build churches, worship icons, and take parts in services in order to further their secretive missionary work. While preaching, the Bogomil apostles were defying torture and death. The sphere of their missionary campaigns extended beyond Byzantium to the whole of Christendom, to all Christians under the sun. So, would you be able to give a brief summary of the Bogomilists?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bogomil, just going off the name itself, is a direct translation of the Greek Theophilus, which means lover, or in some translations, friend of God. And it more or less originates as this dualist tendency in what we believe is lower Greek monasticism. So when I mean lower Greek monasticism, it's not necessarily abbots or the tippy tops of Orthodox monasteries that are embracing this, but it belongs to this very ascetic, extremely ascetic tendency within some early Eastern Orthodox um, um, groups, and again, which could be traced more or less. This is not going to make people happy, but probably has some precursors in the excesses of Egyptian monastics and Palestinian monastics trying to follow after Saint Anthony, but also is contemporaneous with Christian heresies more broadly speaking, and is in and of itself not just derivative but in many areas novel. And you have Bogomil's tracks, and you referred to it earlier. I believe that the book of the two principles, is a very active Bogomilist tract being produced in reaction to other dualist teachings of the same time period and of accepted Catholicity and Orthodoxy. So you have these various strands being brought together, and then you have and I agree with Stoyanov. Stoyanov essentially traces the coalescence of the Bogomil identity to both this extreme Christian ascetic tendency and the arrival of various forms of Armenian and Mesopotamian, or sorry, Armenian and Anatolian heretics in the Bulgarian lands. Bogomils, like you said, were had no problem going to divine liturgy and using icons and teaching. It also seems that they adopted native terminology, and what I mean native terminology for spiritual terms, I mean some of the Hellenic mystery rites, and even local Thracian cults. There's evidence that the vestiges of ancient Thracian religion were co-opted by the Bogomils, and so the Bogomils kind of, I guess, would be the more evangelistic tendencies within Polytheism, although obviously Bogomilism becomes much more potent than Polytheism. um, and they obviously, again, they develop this strong dichotomy between heaven and hell, between good and evil, between the body and the spirit. um, Very origin is implicit in some of their doctrine, which is really unfortunate. I feel bad for Origin sometimes, that he has these heretics that end up agreeing with him much after he's already dead. But that's essentially what we're looking at. We're looking at medieval Manicheans, who agree in large part with this Zoroastrian and Iranic influenced angelology and demonology. They're extremely concerned with the body. They're extremely concerned with the spirit. Um, they view the body as almost completely evil. Again, this is this big thread of heresy throughout the ancient and then medieval world. The body is keeping us here in slavery, which is, it's interesting actually. Now that I'm going back to sort of the origins of even our live stream, is that Zoroastrianism, in its earliest form, is like it's a life affirming religion. It's a human affirming religion, whereas this dualism evolves into this, you're not free until your spirit is gone from your body, sort of understanding of hierarchy. And again, the Bogomils are relying on what we discussed earlier, allegorical readings in the New Testament. We're basically refuting the Old Testament. And then it seems that the Bogomils are actually very willing to include certain magical practices in the life of the church, as it were, in the life of the anti-church, so long as it brings you into the fold. And it also seems as though, going through the various ranks of being a Bogomil adept, acolyte, there are various versions of Bogomilism that are revealed to you until you get to the highest rank, which is also, I believe, a feature of Catharism. So, what the listener or the novice might have knowledge of is not necessarily the same Bogomilism that their anti-pope or their anti-bishop might have. It might more garbled form. So again, it's this revealing of those esoteric mysteries, and the Byzantines especially accuse them of reviving ancient Hellenic mystery rites. It looks very similar to some of the Dionysian or Aphroditic rites, the Delphic rites as well. They're accused of reviving the Delphic rites, and then obviously this all coalesces around uh, some early attempts at a Bulgarian Slavic identity. Bogomil, again, being that old Slavonic rendering of Theophilus. Um, Bulgarians are looking for concrete identity, and you have Bulgarian emperors, using Bogomils as diplomats, and at the same time they're courting the Pontiff of Rome, and at the same time they are appealing to the patriarchal seat in Constantinople. So I believe the journey of the Bogomils is not just an independent spiritual coalescence, which it obviously is, but it also is formed in large part by the historical context of an emerging Bulgarian imperial identity. So, that was a lot. I'm sure you have questions, or I'm sure there are different threads we can bring together. But that is essentially my understanding of the Bogomils. And of course, the Paulicians and Bogomils um, are so in the land, as it were, are so in the hearts and minds of vast swaths of southeastern Europe and the Balkans, that their myths, their legends are transferred into folk mythology up till the modern day. You have evidence actually in Romania, very near where I was raised, of Paulician presence, and we know of Paulicians up until the 16th and 17th centuries, ethnic Bulgarian Paulicians in eastern Croatia and northern Serbia. So it's a potent mixture that we're looking at, potent time of extreme spiritual excess in European history.
What I'll do is let Stoyanov substantiate many of the points you brought up, in particular referring to Bogomilism, its links with Catharism, and the whole notion of religious rights, anti-baptism, and indeed the whole notion of slavery, materialism, the incarceration of the soul. I'll read out these few pages, and then if there's anything to comment on, we'll probably end the stream there. But thank you. That was a wonderful oration.
Absolutely.
The first testimony, so this is Stoyanov, the first testimony to the magnitude of the Bogomil proselytism and expansion in Western Anatolia is a long letter written in about 1050 by the monk Eutemius from the Periblepros monastery in Constantinople. For reference, the Bulgarian Empire had been destroyed at this point. The monastery itself had been infiltrated by 4 Bogomil missionaries who had led Eutemius, his own disciple, astray, and earlier traveling presbyter who turned out to be a Bogomil preacher had attempted to convert Eutemius himself. In order to expose these proselytizers, Eutemius decided to risk another attempt at conversion at the hands of their first teacher and endured an exhausting heretical sermon with quotations from the Gospels, St. Paul's epistles, the Psalms, St. John of Chrysostom, and the Church Fathers, as the monk said, from all scriptures. The heretics were then imprisoned in separate cells, and Eutemius questioned them individually about their teachings. What Eutemius comprehended was that the heretics' thorough knowledge of the scriptures derived from a satanic force that entered them on their heretical baptism, the so-called second baptism. Eutemius declared that during this baptism, the Gospels were placed on the novice's head, and they were mesmerized with well-known Gospel verses, while the initiating teachers of evil recited a secret satanic incantation presented as a revelation of St. Peter. This was alleged to banish the blessing of the Holy Ghost from the soul of the proselytizers and replace it with the seal of the devil, transforming the initiates into the devil incarnates, whose sole purpose was to lure Christ's flock into the repulsive and godless heresy. This short but expressive dominological expose is in all probability, Eutemius's own garbled and diabolized version of a rite that raised the dualist neophyte, the listener, to the rank of the dualist believer, which is referenced in other Orthodox accounts of Bogomilism as the baptisma. Eutemius confirmed that the first heretical baptism was only a prelude to a gradual initiation into the teachings that prepared the believer for the grade of the perfect, or in Eutemius's version, for the unholy service of the devil and his mysteries. For 1 or 2 years, the neophyte was lured into a series of revelations of evil knowledge until finally he was initiated into the whole heresy and madness. Eutemius gave another expose of the rite that was supposed to erase all traces of Christian baptism, probably the consolamentum, which admitted the dualist believer to the elite ascetic grade of the perfect. Later Orthodox versions of the consolamentum and the teleosis confirmed that the rite was preceded by a period of prolonged asceticism and instruction, and that the consecration comprised in laying the gospel on the head of the proselyte, following by the hands of the perfect amid hymns and thanksgiving. 2 Western versions of the Cathar consolamentum, which was certainly formulated under Bogomil influence, have also been preserved, and they present some obvious parallels to early Christian baptism. Yet for Eutemius, The ultimate dualist rite transformed the erstwhile heretical disciples into apostles and teachers ordained by the devil. While denouncing them as apostles of darkness, God's enemies, and the devil's henchmen, he reaffirmed that the Bogomils renounced all church services, the veneration of the cross, the cult of the relics, and the efficacy of the Eucharist. Despite his claims of direct knowledge of the secret writings of heresy, in his exposure of heretical teachings is scant and confused. Eutemius's version of Bogomil cosmology, God created the seven heavens, whereas the expelled prince of this world, the devil, created the eighth, visible heaven, the earth, the sea, paradise, and man. In the visible universe, ruled by the fallen prince of the world, only the sun and the soul of man are from God, but was stolen by the devil. As God's creation, however, the soul was constantly escaping from the satanic body of man. Finally, the devil had to resort to an ingenious technique to entrap it. He ate all the flesh of the unclean animals and emitted this impurity on the soul in order to defile it and compel it to remain in the body of Adam. These teachings evidently reflect the old Gnostic myth of the fallen demiurge coupled with the Orphic Gnostic concept of the incarnation as an exile in a bodily prison. The heretics, moreover, apparently did not revere the traditional Christian Trinity, and Eutemius suspected them of worshipping some mysterious satanic trinity in which the Holy Ghost was the spirit of evil. The Son was the son of perdition, and the Father was Satan himself. At the same time, Eutemius alluded to the claims of the Bogomil apostles of esoteric knowledge of God's secrets in the Gospels, hidden for the others in parables, Mark 4:11, but confusingly stated that they called themselves true Christians after their father, the Antichrist. He also maintained that during the Bogomil initiation, anything taught prior to the second baptism was refuted after the rite, and newly imparted Bogomil mysteries were altered further following the final heretical baptism. And as should be apparent, it's simply a fusion in many ways of so many of the threads that we brought up. And
Absolutely.
again, this is confirmed finally in the final segment as this relates between Bogomilism and Catharism. As in Bogomilism, the division between the believer and the perfect in Catharism was fundamental for the organization of the sect. Following the spiritual baptism with the placing of the hands, the consolamentum, the new consuled Cathar perfect, assumed a black robe to enter a life of strict asceticism, prayer, and preaching. The Catholics sometimes called the perfects the robed heretics, while among the Cathars they were known as good Christians or good men. Not themselves bound by the austere standards of the good men, the believers who formed the great majority in the sect secured the livelihood and protection of the Cathar elite. Besides attending some of the ceremonies of the perfecti, the believers ritually saluted the good men with a bow and a request for a blessing and a prayer that they become good Christians and be brought to a good end via the consolamentum. The perfecti responded with a blessing and a prayer for a final baptism and death in the Cathar sect. Crucially, the consolamentum was intended to secure the reunification of the soul with its heavenly spirit, restoring its heavenly status before the fall. Notions transmitted somehow to the medieval dualists from early Eastern, probably Syrian Christianity, the ritual exchange between the perfecti and the believers hence was known as the, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that properly, melioramentum, the improvement. Although the
That's
Catholic
honestly the best I've heard.
Thank you. Although Catholic commenters like Bernard Gui preferred to style it an adoration, the approximate number of the Cathar perfecti at the beginning of the 13th century was estimated between 1,000 and 1,500. In its spread throughout the Languedoc, Catharism rose to vital prevalence in the areas between Toulouse, Carcassonne, and Albi. Albi, by the way, is where we get the etymology for Albigensian Crusade. Early Catharism in the Languedoc and Lombardy, that being in northern Italy, inherited the monarchical dualism of the Bogomil system, where the evil creator of the material world was a power ultimately subordinate and inferior to the good father. Following the great Cathar council at Saint Felix de Caraman, Catharism saw a resurgence of the doctrines of absolute dualism, which posed an inexorable opposition between two co-eternal and co-equal powers, the good and the evil God. As we've mentioned, essentially the situation the fraught political situation in Bulgaria and the reconquest of that region by Byzantium until the collapse of Byzantine authority in the Balkans, really around the time of the reign of Andronikos. As it pertains to the Languedoc, the Albigensian Crusade is called during the pontificate of Innocent III at the beginning of the 13th century, following the death of a papal legate. It involves a major political struggle in the sense that the Count of Toulouse, Raymond, is accused of harboring heretics and not being officious in terms of him stamping out heresy within the region. For reference, Cathars were moving all across Europe. They had a stronghold in Cologne, of all places, before migrating to the Languedoc, where essentially they were able to thrive, and they were able to ingratiate themselves in many of the noble houses, such as, if I recall, the Travencels, the royal family of, or the ducal family, essentially, of Carcassonne, who weren't even, it should be mentioned, vassals of the French monarchy. They were actually vassals of the Aragonese monarchy. So in pursuing a crusade in the Languedoc, you had a situation essentially where you were not only waging war on the territory, again, nominally loyal to the French king, but you had a recalcitrant count who was very resistant essentially to have his authority completely and utterly usurped. And you had the influence of a king in Spain, the King Peter of Aragon, if I recall, fighting for his interests. And in the middle of this, you have a widely dispersed and incredibly influential cult of what, again, the Christians would view as Manicheans. And into the situation, you have the intervention of Simon de Montfort, who is able to establish a brief Crusader kingdom within the region, but it collapses, and there is a brief resurgence of the Cathar movement in the region before we finally have the Crusade of the French crown in the 1220s, which brings the monarchy of France into the Languedoc for the first time. And it's really this conquest, among other things, and many of the actions and you can say atrocities committed by both sides and by Simon de Montfort in particular that have, again, lent credence in terms of modern parlance for this idea of a quote-unquote war on the people of the Languedoc and what would essentially be their own particularistic religion, which is Catharism. So by the time we arrive in the middle to the late 13th century, the Inquisition has become an incredibly powerful force within French society, the Dominicans in particular, and it has become thoroughly wedded to the power of the French monarchy in Paris, as we see with other instances like the dissolution of the Knights Templar. All this is to say is that by the beginning of the 14th century, Catharism in the Languedoc, which had basically been in a political ascendancy at the beginning of the 13th century, was more or less completely stamped out. And in terms of, I'm sure, an example that you would like to bring up before we draw this conversation to a close is the situation which you've already alluded to in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see sort of, a desire almost from the papacy for Bosnia to be another successful crusade, right? Essentially in the heartland of European civilization and Christian civilization, and you already have this native Church of Bosnia, as just to say, give modern terms to what undoubtedly was not actually called the Church of Bosnia, but you have a local tradition that's not necessarily in schism with Rome or Constantinople. It's more likely a mix of the two, mix of some folk Christianity that's not necessarily heretical, but then you have a highly organized Bogomil and then later Cathar influence come in, and it becomes more associated with this. And like you said, a lot of these orders, monastic orders, are sort of vying with themselves to be able to go send missionaries to Bosnia. And I do believe the Dominicans eventually won out. And you have the papal see asking the King of Hungary to intervene. Hungary having just recently conquered Croatia. And then the picture is further complicated with mostly Orthodox Herzegovina and parts of Serbia getting into the mix, and then you have independent local rulers who actually use Cathars, which at this point in history are becoming, they're being called Patarines through the wonderful linguistic as if it wasn't complicated enough, we have to have another name for essentially the same exact people group, or the same exact set of ideas and beliefs. You have local Christians using Cathars and Bogomils as diplomats to go back and forth between them and the papacy, and then Bosnian kings wanting to be crowned, and then the papacy is asking them, well, when you go back, you have to convert everybody, and then they don't end up doing it. All of this happening, all these different crusades and counter crusades and promises of baptism and false hopes, um, while the war drums of the Ottoman Turks are beating in the distance. And Stoyanov, especially from someone from Eastern Europe, like myself, he very, very, not indecently, what's the word that I'm looking for? Tantalizingly refers to the possible submission of local Bogomils into the Islamic fold, and even possible influences on Islam of dualistic tendencies in the Balkans. And he kind of stops the book there and leaves us off, and especially for me wanting more. And I think we should mention at this juncture the rather impressive bibliography. When I first bought the book, I was like, "Wow, 500 pages." I think 350 pages of that is actually the bibliography. So it's extremely, incredibly well researched. But yeah, so again, the papacy is looking for.
150. It'd be very
Okay,
impressive if 350 pages were the bibliography. No, I'm just looking at the book now, but yes, it is still, by all standards, a very impressive bibliography. I mean,
good correction.
but for reference, I'm almost amazed that it has become as, for lack of a better word, accessible in terms of it being a very, very dense academic work, which, as far as I'm concerned, is really only accessible to people who have at least some familiarity with all of the history going forward in terms of this. So no, it's quite edifying to find a book which is
Absolutely.
so well researched and so dense can actually reach a larger audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was actually worried when I had first picked it up that it was maybe going to be a little too into, not that narrative history is bad at all, but maybe too much into public history, or popular history. But again, very, very accessible. And I think, just to round out some of my own thoughts concerning the Cathars and the Bogomils, I think one thing, as an independent scholar, as an independent aspirant to being a historian, what really is interesting is how deep into trade networks the original heresies penetrated. Because again, very early on, they are mass agrarian movements, more or less popular movements in Eastern Anatolia, in sort of the buffer zone between the Byzantines and the Persians and the Arabs, and you even have Paulician mercenaries fighting for Arab armies in Sicily, in what would become Outremer in Eastern Anatolia. But how deep, as you said, Cologne of all places becomes a hub of the Cathars, and the Alpine villages in the Pyrenees, and in the Swiss Alps, and northern Italy, these little trading cities. Even Venice and Florence refuse to give up their paterines, their Cathars, to either imperial or papal authority. But yeah, those are some of my closing thoughts.
And you have been an absolutely wonderful guest, and
Thank you.
thank you so much for joining me. I guess because we've already preempted the ending of this conversation in terms of me beginning with Critique and Crisis and talking about Gnosticism in particular, and how this demiurgical sort of quality, this notion of the sublimated elements of Satan, the Antichrist, appear through post-Christian religious displacements like the Enlightenment, which, as far as I'm concerned, is almost sort of pure Gnosticism without the self-awareness.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
is there anything you want to sort of I guess, sort of expand upon before we get out of here this evening?
Um, besides thanking you for being a lovely host and for giving me the opportunity to do this, if your audience is looking, I know that Eastern European historiography is not well translated, and Western audiences might not be sure, especially Anglophone audiences might not be sure on how to approach Eastern European history. I would definitely. Um, Look at Mircea Eliade's book, Zalmoxis, the Vanishing God. It's available in a reprinted format, and then his much more popular book on shamanism. I think both of those add very interesting elements into the entire thread of what we were discussing. And then a student of Eliade that Stoyanov actually references quite a few times, Ioan Coleanu, also in the University of Chicago. He wrote a book on the history of Gnosticism called, I believe, The Tree of Knowledge or The Tree of Gnosis. I'm probably butchering the title, but it's very easily accessible. It's one of, I believe, two or three books that he wrote, just for further reading. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, and do check out the bibliography. We have a super chat just coming in, so I'll just read that. Fred Varley, MM7JT for £20. Thank you very much. Great stream, gents. Thank you. Forgive my naivete. Could dualist tendencies come from more Indo-European beliefs, or is it more innate? Perhaps something like love of opposites, Gnostic life denial is quite peculiar as well. Well, the interesting thing is, I think David and I are both of the opinion that it's not so much peculiar as it's just an endemic feature of all sort of religious and intellectual life in various extreme sort of iterations. As with the Turkic examples, the Tengristic examples, the Central Asian examples, I referenced an umbrella term, a rather archaic term, which is tyrannism. Bulgaria becomes fully sort of enmeshed in all of these ideas seemingly at the same time, which is why so many later scholars seem to have this. I'm not, perhaps fetishism is a bit too cruel regarding the great what if scenario of the Bulgarian Empire. It is interesting, but yes, I think it is virtually all encompassing. I mean, in terms of the Indo-Europeans, I mean, Zoroastrianism is literally an Aryan belief system, which has been around for, at the very least, sort of 3,000 years. So yes, it is an extremely old tradition that predates Christianity and is contemporaneous with much sort of older Old Testament Judaism.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add to that, in his shamanism book, Eliade does go into some interesting dualist myths that are very widespread throughout Eastern Europe and seem to possibly have a home in the Altaic mountain regions in Siberia and Asiatic Russia. But again, just to reiterate what we've already discussed, this just seems to be a feature, not a bug of human religion, of how we experience and understand religion and spirituality um, as a planet, as humanity. Now, obviously, the forms in which it will manifest are very different. We've seen that throughout the entire podcast, the entire live stream, and are very interesting and are all worthy of being explored. Even if it's just for their few parts that are novel. But yeah, that's a great question.
So thank you very much. I think we will leave it here. And the last question I have for you, David, is what projects do you have coming up, and where can we find you again?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just some projects that are in the pipeline. You should be looking for Ruxandra and I to be announcing a project soon. On Twitter, you can find me at David Banika RO. That's just my Twitter handle. I'm very easy to find on X, on Twitter. And then I'm also writing a book. I'm in the process of writing a book. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I will throw a dog bone out there. It is about the Italian Renaissance and artificial intelligence. And I promise the two have something to do with each other. But you can mostly find me on Twitter.
Another super chat coming from BB3003 for $7 Canadian. Thank you. Since in your recent streams you brought up Francis, will you ever make a stream specifically on him? I'm afraid you're going to have to be more specific on who you mean by Francis, because I look at that and I think, do you mean Emperor Francis? Do you mean Francis of Assisi? Do you mean Pope Francis? I don't know who you're talking about. So if you can confirm which Francis you're referring to, because as of now I'm completely lost. But thank you for your super chat.
He might mean Dr. Francis Young. I'm not sure. Of France. Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, it's completely wrong. Missed all the Francis. If I ever do a dedicated, well, I mean, I have done a dedicated stream on the Wars of Religion. Yeah, it seems like 100 years ago now, but it is out there. It exists in 2 parts. There is a 40-minute presentation lecture, and then there is a 2 to 3 hour, I can't remember how long this is, conversation discussion, which is behind a paywall. So it is out there already. All I can say is, in summary, I have a rather sort of low opinion of him, for very obvious reasons. I think allying with the Great Turk to wage war on your fellow Catholics is not the most virtuous thing to do, but there we are, and invite the literal Barbarossa, the terror of the Mediterranean, the lord of the Barbary states, to dock in Toulon. It's also a lovely sort of it reminds me very much of American foreign policy in the sort of the 1990s, what Francis was doing. That's not a comparison you want to draw to any politician. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, David, for being such a wonderful guest, and good night.
Well, thank you very much.